So our scripture today comes from the book of Isaiah. Now, Isaiah is a particularly large book. You'll find it about halfway through the Old Testament. And it's actually a book that covers a great deal of time. What we have now as one kind of big thick book was actually written over a long stretch of time and covers different time periods, different kings, and it's full of both prophecy and history and teaching and all kinds of stuff. It's a very rich book. We're in chapter 11, which is actually fairly early in Isaiah, and it covers a particular piece of time. And it covers the period of time where God's people had a king, and the king was Hezekiah. Now, we've talked about kings before as in our church, and we've definitely talked about the kings of God's people, and that most of them were not particularly good. If you remember, God didn't really even want God's people to have kings, right? It was something that they demanded. And for the most part, it didn't really work out well for them, with only a few exceptions. And one of those exceptions was Hezekiah. Hezekiah was seen and is remembered both in Isaiah and other books of the Bible as a particularly good to almost even great king. And as far as kings of God's people go, he rates up there with David and others as people who really did the job well. And so what we have here is interesting, because we have Isaiah writing about both the king of the time, Hezekiah, and what made him a good king. But of course, if you're familiar with this passage, you know that later, especially later after the coming ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus, we would look at this passage of Isaiah not only talking about Hezekiah, this historical king from centuries before, but we would also see this prophecy. We would see this prophecy of what Jesus was and who Jesus was to be. And starting in about the 3rd century, Christians really started to gravitate to these passages as a way of understanding who Jesus was and what Jesus's mission on earth was. Now, the gospel writers love to refer back to Isaiah. It's the book they refer back to almost the most, and especially looking for bits and pieces where they can associate Jesus with this historical expectation of what it is a Messiah, what it is a king would be like. And so Isaiah plays this really important role for us as far as understanding, like, what does it mean? What does a good king look like? What does a leader look like? Who is it that we are going to follow that is going to lead us to this place that we would call God's kingdom? Right? And Jesus talks a lot about God's kingdom and the coming of God's kingdom, and Jesus is there to build God's kingdom. When Jesus hands the task of his work off to the disciples and really gives birth to the church, like we talked about last week at Pentecost, what he's handing off is the task to build God's kingdom. And so what is God's kingdom like? Jesus tells us a lot of things, but here's where we get another example of what is God's kingdom like? Well, it's the place where unexpected things happen. It's a place where the lion or the wolf lays down with the sheep. Right. So when we were putting this together, I thought, well, let's start with something easy. We'll start with an easy kids movie, and actually my daughter, what it is that she thought we should do, and one of the first movies she said we should talk about is Zootopia. She loves this movie. Which is great. And in my mind, I had seen it and I thought, oh, great, that's that movie about like following your dreams and, trying hard. And I thought, that'll be a good way to start. Now, if you watch the movie or really know anything about it, you know that while that is certainly a theme in the movie, trying really hard and following your dreams, what this really is a movie about is a bunny, which is cute and cuddly, sure, but it's a bunny that is confronting discrimination in her chosen profession. While there is a growing civil divide between different groups, including one minority group who has been historically marginalized and unfairly stereotyped. So yeah, a little of the moment, you might say. Now, there's also some really funny bits about, sloths working at the DMV, which is hilarious, and you should Google that clip if you've not seen the film. If you haven't seen the film, you'll be fine. You'll be able to get most of what we're doing. But when as I was watching the movie with my daughter again in preparation for this and taking notes, I was like, oh my gosh, this feels so real and relevant to what we are all dealing with, both as individuals but as a community and as a country right now. And so I had done that in the morning, and I'd watched that in the morning, and then later that evening I actually dropped in on our youth group that has been meeting over Zoom, these wonderful, faithful people. And the topic that they were actually discussing together in really some important, substantive, and heartfelt ways was this idea of prejudice. They were talking about the reality of racism in our country, and they weren't running away from that conversation, our amazing young people, but we're really kind of wrestling with it and struggling with it in a way that I found really hopeful, and I found myself challenged by, because I was thinking about the sermon. I was like, oh my gosh, we're all so tired. There's so much going on. Like, how many more things can we be dealing with at once? Do we really want to dive into this? But if the movies our children are watching are dealing with it, if our youth are able, with everything that they are going through, to embrace hard conversations, how can we, as a community, not do the same? So, Zootopia is a movie, about a bunny. It's a bunny who has a dream to be a police officer, even though there has never been a bunny police officer. And she lives in this world where animals have evolved, and they all walk upright, and they wear clothes, or at least most of the time they wear clothes. Watch the movie, and of course they can talk, and they're trying to figure out like how to live life together between all these different groups. And you've got incredibly large animals like elephants, you got little tiny animals like mice, but you also have former predator animals like wolves and cheetahs, and you've also got former prey animals like bunnies and sheep. And how do they get along? And how do they make it work? And so Judy, our main character, the bunny at the center of all this, has this dream of going to Zootopia and living in Zootopia. And the idea that she has as a bunny who was literally like raised out on a farm in the countryside, raising carrots. Because what else would a bunny raise? Raising carrots out in the country, wants to move to the big city and become a police officer. And she has it in her mind that the city is this place where they've got it figured out, where animals have learned to live with each other. And it's this kind of idealized sort of notion that she has. And of course, she shows up. And it's not quite what she is expected. Now, through much trials and tribulations, she actually does go on and get to be a police officer, but has a rather interesting first day, shall we see. Now, I want to show you a clip, but with the whole thing with copyright and YouTube and movies and all that kind of stuff, that can be a little precarious. So we came up with a slightly different way to do it. So here is the scene of Judy, our main character, bunny, getting her first assignment on her first day as a big city cop.
And finally, our first bunny, Officer Hopps. Parking duty dismissed.
Parking duty? Chief Logo!
What?
You said there were 14 missing animal cases.
So
I can handle one too. You probably forgot, but I was top of my class at the academy.
Didn't forget. I just don't care.
Sir, I'm not just a token bunny.
Well, then writing 100 tickets a day should be easy.
100 tickets? I'm not gonna do 100 tickets. I'm gonna do 200 tickets before noon.
So a shout out to the Sasano girls for an amazing job there, and the costumes were excellent. Now there's a theme in this scene. It's a theme throughout the movie, and the theme, but it may not be totally obvious, and that theme is meekness. Now in both the scripture in Isaiah we read today, we hear this idea of meekness. Jesus himself would talk about it in the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes and say, "Blessed are the meek." Now in English, because meekness sounds really close to weakness, we tend to use them interchangeably, but that's not actually really fair. Weakness is really about the ability, not having the strength or not having the ability to do something. Meekness is about constraining your strength. It's about choosing to do or not to do something. When you put a bit into a horse's mouth, that's called meeking the horse, right? It doesn't make the horse any less strong, but it constrains the strength and allows the strength to be directed. So when the Bible talks and really elevates this idea of meekness, it's not that they want us to be all like demure and "Oh, thanks for noticing us." No, that's not it at all. It's about recognizing first and foremost to be meek. You first must recognize you do indeed have strength, right? You do have strength. You do have ability. But it's about choosing to use and how we choose to use our strength and our ability. Are we using it in an intentional and directed way, or are we just using it to impose our will on others? So Isaiah lifts up this idea of meekness, and Judy really embodies that here in this moment, because she feels like she could do more, right? Like she was the top of her class in school. Like there are important work to be done. There are missing mammals that need to be found, and she's being asked to do parking duty. Like that's the lowest of the low jobs, right? Like why is she getting that when she could be doing so much more? And so what's interesting in the scene, though, is that what she chooses to do, right? You know, she could just decide to quit, right? She could, I'm not doing this. She could continue to yell at her sergeant. She could file a grievance. She could do any sorts of things to try to force her way into something, into where she thinks she belongs. But instead, she constrains herself, right? And she decides to direct the strength and the energy that she has. And it's like, okay, if my job is to write parking tickets, then I'm not just going to write 100 parking tickets. I'm going to write 200 parking tickets, and I'm going to do it before noon. Now, I will say, as someone that has only ever been on the receiving end of parking tickets, I never really saw them as a virtuous thing. So, you know, props to this kids movie for making parking tickets more sympathetic, I guess. Sure. But needless to say, she goes on and she does it, and she does a remarkably good job at it. Now, another character we're going to meet a little bit down the line here is Nick, and Nick is a fox. And when Judy was young, she actually was assaulted, with no better word for it, you know, by a fox. But eventually, she encounters this adult fox named Nick in Zootopia, and they quickly find out that they need to work together if she is going to crack the case that she is on. I don't want to give away too much if you haven't seen the movie, because you really should see it. But Nick is this really interesting character, right? And Nick is kind of the streetwise, you know, and really sort of lives into all of the fox stereotypes. And as we meet him, and for the first chunk of the movie, he's just basically living into all these stereotypes that foxes have, or that people have of foxes. But there comes this scene. There comes a scene in the movie where Judy and Nick are having this conversation, and Nick reveals, much like Judy as a kid didn't want to do necessarily the things that people expected bunnies to do, we learn that Nick, as a kid, didn't want to do the things that people expected foxes to do. He wanted to live and be in a little bit different way. And much like Judy has encountered the prejudice against her, Nick encountered the prejudice that people have against things like foxes. And he has this great line. He says, if the world is only going to see a fox as shifty and untrustworthy, there's no point in being anything else. If we're only going to see certain people in a certain way, is there a point to trying to be something else? Now, the other theme that runs throughout this movie is this idea of fear, right? When the ultimate villain is revealed, and I'm not going to ruin it for you, one of the lines that they, one of the things that we find out that they are doing is trying to use fear as a way of controlling the people of Zootopia. And they have this great line that says, fear always works. Does fear always work? If we let it. But it also, we don't have to live in fear. Now, in the Isaiah passage, when it says the wolf and the lamb will lie down together, we often probably think about the fact that if that's for that to work, the wolf has to like not eat the lamb, right? Like that's primary. And I'm like, sure, like that would be helpful if the wolf didn't eat the lamb. That's good, but that's not the only barrier to the wolf and the lamb laying down together. Yes, the wolf has to not eat the lamb, but the lamb also has to learn to not fear the wolf. The lamb has to learn to not fear the wolf. Are there people or groups, individuals, demographics, whatever way, that we have been taught to fear? In God's kingdom, if we want to live in the kingdom that God and Isaiah and Jesus all talk about, do we need to find a way to transcend and move past that fear? Do we need to be both like the wolf and the sheep? I think we do. The truth is, in this work, in this hard work of building God's kingdom, in this hard work of becoming this place where the wolf and the lamb can lay down well together, we all have work to do. But the work might be different. Some of us need to learn how to be a wolf that doesn't eat the lamb. Some of us have to learn how to be the sheep that doesn't fear the wolf. And we do that by practicing our meekness. We do that by not putting our feelings and our emotions and things that and our experiences on other people. We recognize that everybody has their own. And we do what we can. We do what we can to remember that we do all have different strengths and we do all have different abilities. And what's easy for one of us isn't necessarily going to be easy for others of us. And that when that happens, we need to care about it. In a small way, we've been having to do this a lot as a church. We recognize that there are many out there who have easy access technology, that have smart TVs and fast internet at home. So joining worship in the way that we are doing worship now was fairly easy. But almost immediately, we identified that that wasn't the case for everybody. And so while 90% of everyone would just be fine, and we could have just said, well, that's fine. We'll just worry about the 90%. That's most everybody, isn't it? We recognized there was a 10% that wasn't going to be, and that we needed to do something special and something just for them so that they could continue to experience and participate as much as they could in the way that everyone else was going to get to. So what do we do? What do we do when the challenges seem so big and we don't know how to fix them? It's one of the things that our youth group, when they had this conversation, about everything that was going on in our country right now, they asked, like, what do we do? And behind it, you could hear these problems seem so big. How how could we possibly do anything about them? And we had a good conversation about it, which was good. But it came down to the same one basic idea. And it's one of those basic ideas that is so fundamental, it's actually a fundamental concept of our church. Did you right? You can't fix all on your own, you can't fix these big problems. So fix what you can. You can't do everything. So do something. So I can't think of a better way to end our time together than with Judy's own words. So this comes at the very end of the film. Judy is the commencement speaker at the next graduating class of folks from the police academy. And I want to thank our own Molly Duval for giving us this wonderful rendering.
When I was a kid, I thought Zootopia was this perfect place where everyone got along and anyone could be anything. Turns out, life is a little bit more complicated than a slogan on a bumper sticker. Real life is messy. We all have limitations, we all make mistakes, which means, hey, glass half full, we all have a lot in common. And the more we try to understand one another, the more exceptional each of us will be. But we have to try. So no matter what type of animal you are, from the biggest elephant to our first fox, I implore you, try. Try to make the world a better place. Look inside yourself and recognize that change starts with you. It starts with me. It starts with all of us.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Amen.